A reading from 1 Corinthians, chapter 8, verses 1 through 13. Now concerning food sacrificed to idols, we know that all of us possess knowledge. Knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. Anyone who claims to know something does not yet have necessary knowledge, but anyone who loves God is known by him. Hence, as to the eating of food offered to idols, we know that no idol in the world really exists, and that there is no God but one. Indeed, even though there are many so-called gods in heaven or on earth, as in fact there are many gods and many lords, yet for us there is one God, the one Father from whom all things and for whom we exist, and one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom all things and through him we exist. It is not everyone, however, who has this knowledge. Since some have become so accustomed to idols until now, they still think of food they eat as food offered to an idol, and their conscience, being weak, is defiled. Food will not bring us close to God. We are no worse off if we do not eat, and no better off if we do. But take care that this liberty of yours does not somehow become a stumbling block to the weak. For if others see you, who possess knowledge, eating in the temple of an idol, might they not, since their conscience is weak, be encouraged to the point of eating food sacrificed to idols? So by your knowledge, those weak believers for whom Christ died are destroyed. But when you thus sin against members of your family and wound their conscience when it is weak, you sin against Christ. Therefore, if food is a cause of their failing, I will never eat meat, so that way I may not cause one of them to fall. Here ends the reading. Thanks be to God.
Good morning. The New Testament reading from this morning is from 1 Corinthians, and it's all about the right way to eat meat. There's a good way to eat meat, and there's a bad way to eat meat. So in honor of Paul's letter, I'm going to teach you the best way to pan fry a steak. Now, there's a big argument around about the best way to cook a steak. Is it pan frying? Is it grilling? 90% of the people will say grilling, and I'm probably in that group. But since it's wintertime and not everybody grills outside during the winter, I do. You can tell by my beat up old rustic grill. But for those who don't want to go outside in the cold to grill, I'm going to show you how to pan fry a steak. Now, we need just a few items here. And first of all, we're going to need a big old cast iron skillet. When it comes to cooking meat, it's all about the transference of energy. How do we get the fire into the cow? You need a good heavy cast iron skillet because this just absorbs a lot of heat energy. A lot. If you get a nonstick fry pan or other types of fry pans, there's just not enough mass to it to really hold the heat to get a fry. If you've ever pan fried a steak and it turns out gray and leathery, it's because your pan wasn't hot enough. Get a cast iron skillet and it'll sear up really nice. Now, for the steak itself, we're only going to use kosher salt, and it should be kosher salt, and we'll get into that, and fresh ground black pepper. Regular table pepper is fine. It's going to be too fine. It's going to be kind of peppery, but the fresh ground stuff is usually better. Now, the star of the show here. Right here I have a ribeye steak. It's at Whole Foods, and we'll go into the reasons why here in a little bit, but a good steak will have solid marbling, meaning the fat will be mixed in through the red meat there, and a good marbling means it's going to be more flavorful and just more tender. Now, this recipe you can use for any grill quality steak. That's going to be your sirloins, that's going to be your ribeyes, your tenderloins, your flat iron steaks. If you're really bold, you can go as far as a chuck rib, but your roasted stuff I can't really do like this. Now, there is a conundrum when making a steak. If you want a juicy, tender steak, you got to go slow and low. See, a little biology lesson here is that steak and other meats are made up of muscle tissues. Muscle tissues are connected by this substance called collagen. Collagen makes it just really tough and stick together because you want your muscles to come together. At the temperatures between 120 and 160 degrees, this enzyme starts breaking down the collagen into a substance called gelatin, like from Jell-O. What we mistake as water or moisture in the meat is actually the presence of gelatin from the collagen. The collagen breaks down, the muscle fibers loosen up, and that delicious meat Jell-O gets... That's a weird term. Don't think of it as meat Jell-O, but collagen is what makes it juicy. If you get above 160 degrees, that enzyme falls apart. If it's below 120 degrees, that enzyme doesn't activate. So you want a slow, controlled cook. But it's going to be not as flavorful. It'll have good texture, but the flavor comes from the charring. There's this whole interaction called the Maillard reaction. Google it, it's fascinating stuff. Basically, what tastes the best is when the salt pulls all the tasty, juicy stuff to the top and then forms a crust. If you've ever grilled a steak, the best part of the steak is the grill marks. So if you slow cook a steak, you don't get the delicious char. Now, if you char the steak, it's going to be very tough and it won't be cooked evenly because all the temperature, all the heat just goes right into the surface and doesn't penetrate into the rest of the meat. Now, you should always have a good cut of meat at least a medium, if not medium rare. But if you just do the searing, it's not going to really be cooked at all. So the solution is cook it twice. Behind me I have the oven preheated to 275. This is a pretty thick steak, so we're going to toss it in there for about 17 minutes. Thinner cuts, this is about an inch thick. So like half to 3/4 of an inch, you probably want to go 15 minutes. If you have bigger than an inch, that's not a steak, that's a roast. Good on you. So I'm going to go ahead and toss this in a pan. I'm going to toss it in the oven for 17 minutes, and we'll talk a little bit about Paul and his letter to the Corinthians. Most people who know me know that I really love cooking. My love of cooking started at an early age, and I always tell people that I learned how to cook out of self-defense. My mom was a creative chef. One of her favorite signature meals was the broccoli pizza. Now, pizza is an imaginative word for what she made. It had a Bisquick crust, which was kind of thick and gooey. And rather than traditional pizza sauce, it was made from Campbell's tomato soup, and then of course there was broccoli and some form of cheese on top. Mom thought it was great. My sister and I were hungry, so it worked. So I took over in the kitchen and I taught myself how to cook, and it's passions. Now, one quick note on the steak that I forgot to mention beforehand. Make sure you leave it on the counter covered up for at least an hour beforehand, because again, the thing about cooking meat is about the transfer of heat energy. And if the inner part is cold and the hour later is room temperature, it's not going to cook evenly, and it's just not going to come out as well. So make sure that it's all room temperature before you get started. So Paul is writing to a church in Corinth. Now, we call this 1 Corinthians, but in all likelihood, there were probably several letters before this that we just got lost to history. Paul had a very deep relationship with his church. He very likely started this church, and they knew him, and they would write back and forth as their faith in their community would develop, and Paul would advise them and at times correct them. Paul is a master of tact. He has the greatest way of addressing these people in a way that's very kind and not just people forward. However, the community in Corinth was highly, highly dysfunctional. The point of contention in this passage is all about eating meat. Now, meat in the ancient world was way more rare than we currently have. We don't realize it, but we live in a meat utopia. When the Soviet Union fell and citizens from what would be the former Soviet states would come and immigrate or go on trips in the United States, they would go and they would take pictures of the meat department of grocery stores in the United States. They had never seen so much meat in their entire lives, and that was a tourist attraction just for that area. We fail to appreciate the privilege that we have. We eat meat at almost every meal of our day. And nowhere in all of the world, in all of history, has that been the norm before us. And that's kind of awesome. But back in Paul's time, meat, especially beef, was a once or twice a year kind of treat. It was really expensive. In fact, cattle was a form of retirement policy for most people. Your flock was your wealth, and you're not going to eat your wealth. And if you lived in a city, it was even more rare. Typically what happened is if you were going to get meat in the ancient world, you'd have to wait for a rich person to celebrate. A rich person would go to the local temple to celebrate the birth of a son or a big financial windfall for them or something like that, and they would slaughter the fatted calf, so to speak. And then there would be a big festival that then they would eat the slaughtered animal, and it would be great, but that animal was sacrificed to false idols. Traditional Judaism said that that was incredibly tainted, evil, terrible meat, and you're not supposed to eat it. But it gets more complicated, too. That the leftover meat from that festival was typically sold in butcher shops at a discounted price because old meat's got to go out the door. So a lot of times, faithful people would purchase meat sacrificed at an altar and not even know it. So here's the problem. Part of their community kept pointing fingers at another part of the community saying, that person's eating bad meat. That person's eating bad meat. And Paul writes them to say, look, you and I know, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. He's trying to lift them up to be in the know, to make them feel positive. You and I know that there's only one God. If there's only one God, this meat couldn't have been sacrificed to a false idol because the idol's nothing. So, go ahead and let him eat the meat. Don't bring it up to them that they may be eating meat sacrificed to an idol if they don't know, because that's going to cause them to worry. That's going to cause them anxiety. That's going to cause them to feel like they've sinned. And that creates some very fascinating moral distinctions.
My apologies, the sound from the fan over the hood was just too loud and it overpowered my microphone. You couldn't hear a single thing I was saying. So I'm going to do a quick voiceover here. So I just pulled the steak out of the oven, and as you're seeing, that after it had been in there for about 17 minutes, on one side it's going to be a deep red color, and you flip it over, the side that was on the pan, it's going to be kind of gray. And it was gray because it just didn't get hot enough for a sear. Now, what you want to do is you want to wipe off the top, get all the moisture, as much of the moisture off as possible off the top, and turn your pan on to about a medium-high heat. You want to use canola oil, because canola oil has a very high smoke point. It can get hot without starting on fire. It also has very little flavor. Now, if you wanted to use olive oil, it's got a low smoke point. So olive oil in a pan like that might actually catch fire, but your whole house will just be full of smoke if you do that. So canola oil is the way to go. Fun fact, canola oil is actually an abbreviation. It stands for Canadian Oil Company. It's actually made from a plant called the rapeseed plant. That's rape, R-A-P-E. They switched to canola oil, and for some reason, after the name change, the oil sales really took off. Probably a smart move there. So after you dry off the top, what you want to do is you want to use kosher salt. Now, kosher salt is actually really kind of cool. If you use table salt, it's going to be too fine and too small grain, so it's going to come out salty. But kosher salt, however, it's actually hollow. It's a broad flake and hollow in the middle, so you get a lot of surface contact. And that surface contact will pull all of the juices and stuff to the surface to get a good sear on it. And part of the reason why you want to have all the water and all as much liquid as possible wiped off is that when water hits a hot pan like that, it turns to steam. All the heat energy, take a look at that kosher salt there. All the excess heat energy comes out in the steam and not into the meat, so that way you don't get a good sear. But if you get it dry and you get the salt on there and you get the pepper on there, it'll create the foundation of a good solid crust. Now for that thick of a steak, I'm going to go ahead and sear this for about a minute on a side. Getting my phone out there because it should be exact. It should be exactly the same amount on each side so that way it cooks evenly. A thinner steak, you probably want to go about 45 seconds. You don't want to go less than 45 seconds because that's just not enough time for it to absorb enough heat. So you put it in the pan there and just get it good and sizzling. Then you want to just not touch it at that point. Once the meat hits the pan, it's got to stay there for the crust to form. About halfway through, you do want to pick it up just a little bit for the oil to redistribute so that way you can cook more evenly. Other than that, don't touch it at all. So, as I had mentioned earlier, this piece of meat came from Whole Foods. Whole Foods has this really cool certification process for how the animal is treated and how the animal is raised. This piece of meat was actually grass fed, it was pasture raised, and never went to a feedlot. And that makes a difference in the end quality of the meat and how that meat treats your body when you eat it. And we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a minute. So I'm just going to go ahead and redistribute the oil a little bit to make sure it cooks evenly there. So at that point, after about a minute, you actually want to pull it all the way out of the pan. Look at that good sear there. Right? About 100% of that surface area there is just covered. It's got a good crust on it. Now, you want to pull it out of the pan so that way the pan can heat up again. There I am wiping down the excess water and liquids on the outside to get that good crust. But you want to take it out of the pan at this point because, again, cooking meat is all about the transference of heat energy. We had a hot pan, then we put a piece of meat in there, and some of that heat energy came out of the pan and into the meat. By pulling it out of the pan and peppering it and salting it outside the pan has a chance to reheat, so that way both sides can get a good sear on it. Salt and peppering and putting back in the pan for another minute. Now, after you cook the steak, you want to let it rest. What happens is when the hot temperatures hit the meat, all the moisture, all the water in the meat suddenly becomes vaporized and causes the whole thing to tense up and form a tight little ball. If you let it rest for 5 minutes and not touch it, not cut it or anything after you pull it out of the pan, that gives the moisture in the muscle a little chance to relax. It'll continue to cook and the heat will distribute evenly throughout the whole piece of meat, and at that point everything will relax and will remain juicy. However, if you cut into it while it's resting, the whole thing is going to tense up and it's going to stay tough, and you're going to lose a lot of moisture and a lot of liquid and a lot of flavor if you don't let the meat rest. So here we're just going to quick pick it up so that way you can redistribute the oil there to make it sear evenly. There. And as you can see, on both sides we have about 100% coverage of searing. If you cook it on a grill, as I mentioned, the Maillard reaction, it's that searing, that charring, that's what has the most flavor. If you cook a steak on the grill, those grill marks cover about 10% of the meat. Where if you do it right in the pan, you're going to have a full 100% coverage and a lot more flavor out of it. Now, you don't want to do marinades for a grill or pan steak because marinades will add extra moisture, extra water to the mixture. And that extra water will make sure that it doesn't sear. Steak is good and flavorful by itself. You want to taste the cow and not a sauce. So cook it like that. If anything, don't do a marinade, do a dry rub because that'll add flavor if you really need it. Or just have a fancy sauce. Make a sauce, do some steak sauce. Don't do a marinade because that's just going to ruin the cook.
Paul, in his very subtle, very tactful way, he's making two big points here. The first thing he's doing is calling out privilege. Now, privilege is one of those terms that gets thrown out a lot lately, and I don't think people quite understand what it means. Privilege is just a benefit you have, and we're really bad at realizing the benefits that we truly have in our lives. Like I mentioned earlier, do you ever think about the fact that you can go and pick a dozen different cuts from 4 or 5 different animals right there at Hy-Vee down the road? Do you ever think of that as a privilege? No, you think of that as just life. Well, not everybody has that. Paul, throughout all of 1 Corinthians, he's calling out the privilege. Most notably with the speaking of tongues. The Corinthians were very proud of themselves because they were blessed with an abundance of tongue speaking. Now, as Methodists, we don't really buy too much in the whole gift of tongues, but they thought it was a big deal. And Paul pointed out that this is a privilege. Privilege only gets to be a problem when you use it to either elevate yourself or tear down others. My cooking is a privilege. See, my mom was a single mom. She had 2 kids and 3 jobs, and she did not have the time to invest in cooking well. I had to leave this steak on the counter for an hour. I had to slow cook it for 17 minutes. I then seared it for a minute on each side. Now I'm letting it rest for 5 minutes. All told, this steak probably took an hour and a half to 2 hours to prepare. My mom didn't have that kind of time. J. Kenji Lopez Alt, famous scientific chef, he wrote a book called The Food Lab, and buy that. It's amazing. But in it he says that the finest steakhouse in the world and McDonald's all have one thing in common. They are both fast food restaurants. The goal is to turn the tables over as fast as you can. If you want to do it right, it takes time. And if you have the time to do it right, that's a privilege. So when I go through and I make fun of my mom for being a bad cook, that's me abusing my privilege. That's me thinking less of someone else who doesn't have that privilege. And this applies to so much in our society right now. We are privileged people in a million different ways. Hey, my steak's ready to eat. But when we start looking down at others for their lack of privilege, for their disadvantaged life that we just can't relate to, Paul would call us out on that. He would say that if your privilege causes you to think less of your brother or sister in Christ, then you better give up that privilege. He says if my eating meat causes someone else to sin, I'm never going to eat meat again. Now, I'm about to eat meat, so clearly I'm not going to go that far with that. But it's important for us to recognize the privilege we have. And right now I just want to talk a little bit more about this steak and why we picked this steak and what privilege this steak represents. You see, as I mentioned earlier, this was a pasture-raised, grass-fed, all-American cow. The beef industry, it's complicated. It is very, very complicated. Ranchers try really hard to meet the demand, and we all want to eat a cow, right? Cow is the best thing we can ever have. But that demand has caused a whole industry of issues. Starting with the fact that we cause abuse to the animal. Have you ever driven through Nebraska? If so, I'm sorry. Nebraska. But about halfway through Nebraska on I-80, there is a feedlot that is right there in the interstate, and you smell it. You smell it about 10 miles before you see it. And you see thousands of cows just packed in, and it's unhealthy for them. They are pumped full of hormones, they're pumped full of antibiotics, and again, it's not the rancher's fault, it's not the feedlot's fault, it's just because we want so much beef that this is how we do that. That's how it becomes affordable to do it in such mass quantities. Now, that causes the cow to be unhealthy before it's killed, and like the old saying goes, you are what you eat. And that gets passed on to us. Our increased consumption of meat that has unhealthy background causes us to have increased rates of colon cancer, increased rates of heart disease. It's bad for them. We eat it, it becomes bad for us. On top of that, it creates this whole system where the ranchers barely make a profit. Then it goes to the meat packers who barely have a living wage, and they're put in very extreme conditions. In the time of COVID in Iowa, we had major outbreaks in our meat packing industry that thousands of meat packers were infected and a lot of them died because of the conditions they had to work in. In Iowa, there were lawsuits because the managers were making bets on which of their workers would get sick and die from COVID. And there was a decree from the president to say, hey, meatpacking is an essential industry, which is part of our food industry. It is essential. But the fact that we want it so much, that we put those people through those conditions, that we put those animals through those conditions, that's causing our neighbor to suffer. That's causing us to sin because we want cow that bad. And there's a long history in the Bible of us going after cows specifically causing us to sin. Think of the golden calf with Aaron and Moses. Why did they make a golden calf idol? Well, because the first thing on their mind when they're wandering through the desert is food. And you're not going to make a golden broccoli statue. If you're going to ask a god, if you're going to create a god for food, it's going to be the beef. It's not going to be the asparagus. So from the very early beginnings of our religion, we're just obsessed with eating meat. And it's good. It's good for us. God wants us to have it. In the Hebrew Bible, it's actually part of your tithe to set some aside so that way you can afford to have good festival food. God wants us to have this. But he doesn't want us to pursue it to the point where it causes harm. Now, that gets back to what Paul is talking with the Corinthians about. He doesn't give them a straight answer. He says, look in your heart, with your knowledge, what do you think would be best? And that's what I'm asking you to do right now. I'm not asking you to give up beef. I'm not giving up beef. What my family and I have chosen to do is that we only eat meat a few times a week. And when we do, we go through and we invest in the good stuff. But that's our privilege. Krissa has worked very hard to support my ministry habit and my cooking habits. She gets a benefit from the latter, at least. But not everyone can afford to do it the way we do it. So as we pursue holiness in our food, we have to recognize that this shouldn't be just for those who can afford it. This shouldn't be for the middle class or upper middle class, that everybody should have access to this. So for everyone to get access to this, there has to be compromises. There has to be a wide industry that makes it affordable. That's a hard back and forth. But there's good news. The industry as a whole has gotten so much better in the past decade. I really want you to look up a woman by the name of Mary Temple Grandin. She is a woman who, over the past decade, actually several decades, she's advocated for the humane treatment of cattle as they go through the slaughter process. Now, that actually has a benefit on the beef too, because if they're terrified as they go in, if they're terrified as they're slaughtered, there's going to be a lot of cortisol, a lot of adrenaline in the meat, and that just doesn't taste good. But she has found ways of organizing slaughterhouses so that way the animal is comfortable and at ease up until that very last moment. And what's even cooler about this woman is that she's autistic. She has this special way that her mind works that allowed her to relate to animals in ways that you and I wouldn't. And that's brought about a huge benefit. So, you have knowledge now. You are aware of what goes into cooking meat. You are aware of what goes into producing meat. What is God calling you to do with that knowledge? If he's calling you to cook one of these, take a picture of it and post it in the comments. I would love to see how yours turned out. But I don't mean to leave you with a sense of shame. I want to leave you with a sense of awareness. You are now aware of all that's going on with this whole food industry. And with that awareness, you can make better decisions. You can go through and you can have that special knowledge that Paul was talking about. And hopefully you can use that knowledge to bring about a better life for your family, a better life for your home. And if we all work together, we can make a better life. We're all going to have access to this, and it won't cause the problems it currently does. Because I don't know about you, I'm not giving up beef. But I pray to God that others can have access to it too. God bless.